Life has a way of stripping a man down to his barest essentials. But for William Wynne, it didn't just strip him, it skinned him alive. At 50 years old, after 3 decades of holding the line in places the world would rather forget, William returned home to find himself a stranger in his own life. A legal loophole, a betrayal by those he once trusted, and suddenly the decorated veteran was being escorted off his own property. He had nothing left but his dignity, an old pickup truck, and Smoky, a 30-kilogram German shepherd whose loyalty was the only thing keeping William's heart from turning to stone. Driven out of the city, William ended up in a forgotten corner of Wyoming, a place where the wind whispered through the sagebrush like a warning. He stopped at a local auction where they were selling off worthless tax-delinquent properties. One lot caught his eye, a half-collapsed shack on a rocky, infertile acre that even the vultures avoided. When the auctioneer called for bids, the room was silent. $5, William said, his voice a low, raspy growl that carried the weight of 1,000 battlefields. The room erupted in laughter. To them, it was a joke, a $5 insult for a pile of rotting timber. But as William drove toward his new estate, he wasn't looking at the holes in the roof or the termites in the walls. His moss-green eyes were scanning the terrain, calculating the depth of the bedrock and the line of sight for security. He saw what the bankers and the mockers couldn't: a foundation, a place to disappear, a place to rebuild. As Smoky hopped out of the truck and immediately began patrolling the perimeter, William stood before the ruins of the cabin. To the world, he was a broken man buying a broken dream. To William, it was the start of the most important mission of his life. The neighbors, if you could call people living 5 miles away neighbors, thought William was just another veteran losing his mind in the wilderness. They'd drive by in their expensive rigs, kicking up dust and shouting, "Good luck with the bonfire." But William didn't care about the outside. He started with the floor. While the town thought he was fixing the roof, William and Smoky were actually clearing the debris to reveal something the previous owners had never known: a natural limestone cavern system directly beneath the cabin's footprint. Every night, under cover of darkness, William worked with the precision of a sapper. He wasn't just cleaning, he was reinforcing. He used a $5 cabin as a camouflage shell. From the road, it still looked like a shack, but inside, William was installing a sophisticated hydraulic lift system he'd scavenged from an old shipyard. He wasn't alone in the labor. Smoky was trained to detect structural weaknesses, his keen ears picking up the sound of shifting rock long before any human could. Together, man and dog hauled hundreds of pounds of earth out through a hidden tunnel, replaced by reinforced steel and high-grade concrete. The locals grew suspicious when they saw William's truck returning with heavy industrial batteries and strange military surplus crates. A group of local teenagers decided to prank the old man one night, thinking they'd find a senile veteran sleeping on a dirt floor. They crept up to the cabin, but before they could even reach the porch, they were met by the terrifying silhouette of Smoky. The dog didn't bark. He just stood there, a shadow in the moonlight, his eyes glowing with an intensity that promised a very short life for anyone who stepped closer. The teenagers fled, claiming the $5 cabin was haunted. Little did they know, the ghost was a master engineer building a subterranean fortress. The secret didn't stay safe for long. A massive land development corporation, Aegis Horizon, had been quietly buying up the surrounding acreage for a luxury mountain resort. They didn't want a shabby shack ruining their million-dollar views. They sent a representative, a man in a $3,000 suit named Sterling, to buy out William. Sterling pulled up in a shiny black SUV, stepping gingerly over the dirt as if it were toxic. He offered William $10,000, a massive profit on a $5 investment. William didn't even look up from the piece of wood he was whittling. "Not for sale," he said, the words falling like lead weights. Sterling's smile didn't just fade. It curdled. He threatened William with eminent domain, with building codes, and finally, with unforeseen accidents. William finally stood up, his tall, muscular frame dwarfing the executive. Smoky moved to William's side, a low, tectonic rumble starting in his chest that made Sterling take 2 steps back toward his car. "The land stays," William stated, his moss-green eyes locking onto Sterling's with a predator's focus. The corporation didn't take no for an answer. They sent surveyors, who were actually hired thugs to intimidate the old hermit. They arrived at dawn, armed with bats and a bulldozer, thinking they were going to flatten a simple wooden shack. They expected to find a man huddled in a sleeping bag. What they found instead was a perimeter that had been tactically mapped by a special ops veteran. As the bulldozer's blade touched the first inch of William's soil, a series of high-intensity floodlights hidden in the trees erupted, blinding the crew. And then, from the shadows of the rotting porch, the $5 cabin began to transform. The retreat of the corporate thugs was only a temporary victory, and William knew it. Aegis Horizon wouldn't stop until the cabin was a memory. But as the sun climbed over the Wyoming horizon, the true nature of the $5 shack began to manifest. This wasn't just a home. It was a masterclass in tactical deception. William had spent his remaining military pension not on luxury, but on high-grade reinforced polymers and lead-line shielding. To the casual observer, the cabin was rotting wood. To a thermal scanner, it was invisible. Inside, William and Smoky moved with practiced synchronicity. William activated the primary power grid, a silent, vibration-dampened geothermal generator. He had painstakingly installed 40 feet below the frost line. The floor didn't just hold his weight. It was a pressure-sensitive diagnostic array. If a footstep didn't match William's biometric signature or Smoky's 4-point gate, the house itself would go into lockdown. The interior walls, once covered in peeling wallpaper, now slid back on silent tracks to reveal a command center that would make a Navy SEAL proud. But it wasn't about the technology, it was about the why. As William looked at a faded photograph of his old unit pinned to a titanium-reinforced pillar, he remembered the oath he took to protect the defenseless. He knew that Aegis Horizon wasn't just after his land. They were planning to divert the local water table for their resort, which would leave the nearby farming community parched and bankrupt. The $5 cabin was the last line of defense for the entire valley. Smoky sat by the main monitor, his black and tan ears twitching at the sound of a drone humming in the distance. The corporation was sending in eyes from the sky. William cracked his knuckles, a grim smile playing on his square-jawed face. "Let them look," he whispered. "They won't like what they see." Sterling, the corporate fixer, didn't like losing. By the third week, the legal route was abandoned in favor of something much darker. Aegis Horizon hired a private security firm, mercenaries who specialized in asset liquidation. They arrived at 3 o'clock hours, draped in night vision gear and carrying specialized breaching charges. They thought they were hitting a shack. They thought they were dealing with a lonely old man and a dog. They were wrong on both counts. As the first mercenary, he placed a charge on the front door. He didn't realize he was already being watched by a dozen infrared cameras hidden in the surrounding sagebrush. Inside the bunker, William Wynne watched the thermal signatures on his primary display. He didn't reach for a rifle immediately. He reached for a control panel. Smoky, position Alpha. He commanded in a low whisper. The dog vanished into a hidden tunnel system that ran beneath the porch. The explosion was loud, but when the smoke cleared, the door wasn't gone. It had merely shed its wooden skin to reveal a solid 6-inch titanium steel slab that hadn't even been dented. The mercenaries froze. Suddenly, the ground beneath them began to vibrate. From the rotting floorboards of the porch, high-pressure non-lethal sonic emitters emerged, blasting a frequency that scrambled their equilibrium. In the confusion, Smoky emerged from a vent behind them, a black-and-tin blur of fury that disarmed the lead operative before a single shot could be fired. William stepped out into the night, not with a weapon, but with a camera and a satellite uplink. Every second of their illegal assault was being broadcast live to the local news and federal authorities. The Madman Shack was now a global stage. The battle wasn't just on the surface anymore. As the federal authorities began their long drive toward the remote property, William invited the local community leaders, the same people who had mocked him, to see the truth. He didn't do it to gloat. He did it because the mission was bigger than one man. He led them to the $5 shack, down the hydraulic lift, and into the heart of the mountain. What they saw left them speechless. It wasn't just a bunker. It was a life support system for the entire region. William had built a massive filtration plant that drew water from deep artesian wells, far below where the corporation was trying to poison the supply. He had stored enough grain, medicine, and emergency supplies to sustain the valley through a decade of drought or disaster. "You saw a shack," William told him, his voice echoing in the vast, clean steel halls. "I saw responsibility." Smoky walked ahead of the group, his tail wagging slightly for the first time, sensing the shift from war to peace. The townspeople realized that while they were chasing property values and luxury, the man they called crazy had been building their survival. But the corporation wasn't dead yet. Sterling had one final card to play, a legal injunction that claimed William's underground structure was an unauthorized military facility and a threat to national security. As the sirens of the federal convoy grew louder, William Wynne stood in his subterranean garden, looking at a single green sprout growing under artificial sunlight. He had fought many wars for his country. Now, he was prepared to fight the last one for his home. The dust from a federal convoy hadn't even settled when Agent Graves stepped out of the lead black SUV. He wasn't a corporate thug. He was a man of the law, carrying a warrant that labeled William's $5 cabin a threat to national infrastructure. The irony wasn't lost on William. He had spent his youth defending that very infrastructure, only to be branded a threat by it in his silver years. As Graves approached the rotting porch, he expected a barricaded madman. Instead, he found William Wynne sitting on a wooden chair, cleaning a pair of muddy boots, with Smoky lying calmly at his feet. "Mr. Wynne, we have reports of unauthorized subterranean construction and high-grade military technology," Graves announced, his eyes scanning the seemingly derelict shack. William didn't stand up. He didn't reach for a weapon. He simply pointed to a QR code etched into a wooden post. "Everything you need is in the public cloud, Agent. My permits, my blueprints, and the live feed of your department's budget being funneled into Aegis Horizon's pockets." The air went cold. Graves hesitated, his hand hovering near his sidearm. Smoky's ears pricked up, but he didn't growl. He simply stood, his 30-kilogram frame a wall of muscle between the veteran and the law. William finally stood, his broad shoulders casting a shadow that seemed to swallow the federal agents. "You're here because they told you I built a weapon," William said, his moss-green eyes piercing through Graves' aviator shades. "But I didn't build a weapon. I built a mirror. And right now, the whole world is looking into it." Outside the perimeter, news choppers began to circle like vultures, their cameras capturing the standoff for a global audience. The $5 cabin was no longer secret. It was a fortress of truth, while the federal agents searched the upper levels of the shack. The data William had leaked began to ignite the internet. It wasn't just about a cabin anymore. It was about a conspiracy that reached into the state capitol. The worthless acre William bought for $5 sat directly atop the primary conduit for the region's new water reclamation project. Aegis Horizon had planned to accidentally contaminate the local wells, forcing the farmers to sell their land for pennies, so the corporation could build their lithium extraction plant under the guise of a luxury resort. William hadn't just built a bunker. He had built a vault for the truth. Deep in Level 3, Smoky led a team of federal forensic accountants, not through a minefield, but through a library of physical evidence. Ledgers, recorded bribes, and soil samples that proved the corporation's intent. The crazy veteran had used a special ops intelligence training to run a counter-espionage operation for 2 years. He had anticipated every move Sterling and Aegis would make. The mood at the site shifted. Agent Graves, once an adversary, now looked at William with a burgeoning respect. He saw the scars on William's arms, not just from the war, but from the back-breaking labor of building a sanctuary for a community that had turned its back on him. "Why did you do it when?" Graves asked, looking at the massive underground water filters. William looked at Smoky, who was currently guiding a young technician through the narrow corridors. "Because when the world goes dark," William replied, his voice a low rumble, "someone has to be the one holding the flashlight, and I've always been comfortable in the dark. But a cornered rat is always the most dangerous." Sterling, facing the total collapse of his career and a life behind bars, decided that if he couldn't have the land, no one could. In a final, desperate act of sabotage, he bypassed the corporate chain of command and triggered a remote detonation sequence on a nearby dam project, a project Aegis Horizon had used as a front for their lithium exploration. If the dam blew, a wall of water would sweep through the valley, erasing the $5 cabin and all the evidence inside it. The alarms in William's bunker began to wail. It wasn't a breach, it was a seismic warning. "He's blowing the North Ridge Dam," William whispered, his square jaw tightening until the muscles stood out like iron cables. He knew he only had minutes. The federal agents panicked, heading for the surface to escape the potential flood. But William stayed. He looked at Smoky. "We have to override the secondary sluice gates, or this whole valley is gone." William didn't flee for his life. He dove deeper into the bunker. He had designed a fail-safe, a heavy-duty reinforced conduit that led directly to the dam's control relay, which he'd secretly tapped into during construction. But the manual override was located in a flooded maintenance tunnel. As the first tremors of the distant explosion rattled the Quonset frame, William Wynne and Smoky plunged into the dark water. This was the moment everything had led to, not just survival, but sacrifice. The veteran and his dog were the only things standing between a town that hated them and total annihilation. The water didn't come as a wave. It came as a roar that shook the very foundations of the earth. Inside the maintenance tunnel, the pressure was mounting. William Wynne felt the cold Wyoming runoff clawing at his chest, threatening to pull him into the abyss. He had reached the manual override for the secondary sluice gates, but the mechanism was jammed with years of corporate neglect. Every second he spent wrestling with the iron will was a second the dam moved closer to A. Catastrophic breach. "Go, Smoky! Get out!" William shouted, his voice muffled by the rushing water. But the 30-kilogram German shepherd refused to budge. Smoky wedged his powerful body against a steel strut, providing a steady anchor for William to brace his feet against. The bond between the veteran and his K9 was no longer just loyalty. It was a structural necessity. With a guttural roar of his own, William put every ounce of his 50-year-old muscle into the turn. The rusted gears screamed in protest, sparks flying underwater as metal ground against metal. Slowly, agonizingly, the wheel began to move. Above ground, the massive steel gates of the North Ridge Dam groaned open, diverting the lethal wall of water into the uninhabited canyon bypass. The town of Oakhaven was saved, but the cost was being paid in the dark. The maintenance tunnel began to collapse under the redirected pressure. William grabbed Smoky by the tactical harness, pulling the dog toward a narrow exhaust vent. He didn't know if they would make it out, but as the water rose to the ceiling, William's last thought wasn't the $5 he spent on the cabin. It was the thousands of lives that would wake up tomorrow because a crazy man stayed behind. When the federal agents and townspeople returned to the site of the cabin, they found a scene of devastation. The diversion of the flood had caused a localized cave-in. The rotting wooden shack, the $5 insult, had finally collapsed into the earth, leaving nothing but a jagged hole and a pile of gray timber. Sterling, watching from a distance before his arrest, let out a hollow laugh. He thought he had won. He thought the evidence, the veteran, and the dog were buried forever under the weight of the Wyoming soil. But the silence was broken by a sound that made Agent Graves stop in his tracks. A rhythmic thumping from beneath the debris. Suddenly, a massive steel plate, part of the bunker's hidden emergency egress, burst upward through the shattered wood of the porch. A hand, covered in blood and silt, reached out. It was William Wynne. He pulled himself onto the dry earth, his clothes shredded, his salt and pepper hair plastered to his forehead with mud. But he didn't come out alone. Following him, coughing but alive, was Smoky. The dog's black and tan coat was gray with dust, but his aggressive yet loyal expression hadn't faded for a second. William stood up, his broad shoulders trembling with exhaustion, looking at the ruins of the cabin he had bought with his last $5. The townspeople, the same ones who called him crazy, stood in a circle, silent. They weren't looking at a hermit anymore. They were looking at a man who had sacrificed his sanctuary to save their homes. William reached into his pocket and pulled out a damp, crumpled $5 bill he'd kept as a reminder. He dropped it into the mud. He didn't need the cabin anymore. The truth was out, and his mission was complete. The aftermath of the blizzard of the millennium and the Aegis conspiracy changed Wyoming forever. Sterling and the corporate board of Aegis Horizon were handed life sentences for domestic terrorism and environmental sabotage. But for William Wynne, the victory wasn't found in a courtroom. It was found in the new foundation being poured on the very spot where the $5 cabin once stood. This time, the whole town was there to help. They didn't build another shack. They built a community center, a fortress of readiness named after Smoky. William didn't move back into the city. He stayed on his acre, but he wasn't a hermit anymore. He became the valley's emergency director, training the next generation of scouts and responders. He still lived partially underground, but now the doors were always open to those who wanted to learn. Smoky, now the most famous dog in the state, became the lead trainer for the region's new K9 search and rescue unit. In the evenings, you can still find William Wynne standing on the ridge, his moss-green eyes scanning the horizon. He's 50 now, his salt and pepper hair a little whiter, his wrinkles a little deeper, but his spirit is unyielding. He knows that the world will always have storms, and there will always be those who mock the man who prepares. But as he looks down at the thriving valley below, he knows he proved one thing. A man's worth isn't measured by the price of his house, but by the strength of the walls he builds to protect others. And sometimes the best life you can build starts with nothing more than $5 and a loyal dog. The storm of nature had passed, but the storm of justice was just beginning to howl. As William Wynne and Smoky stood amidst the ruins of their $5 sanctuary, the evidence they had preserved began to dismantle the Aegis Horizon empire piece by piece. Federal agents, led by a transformed Agent Graves, used William's subterranean server as the black box of the corporate conspiracy. Every bribe, every doctored environmental report, and every order to liquidate the hermit was now screaming from the headlines of every major news network. Sterling, the man who thought he could buy the world for $10,000, was found hiding in a private hangar, ready to flee to a non-extradition country. But he hadn't accounted for the reach of a man who knew how to track shadows. William hadn't just leaked the data. He had predicted Sterling's escape route with the cold precision of a hunter. When the federal marshals swarmed the hangar, they found the gates already locked from the outside by a remote override controlled from a battered tactical tablet in William's scarred hands. As Sterling was led away in irons, he caught a glimpse of a tall, muscular figure standing on a ridge overlooking the airfield. It was William Wynne, his salt and pepper buzz cut, catching the cold morning light, his moss-green eyes devoid of hatred, only filled with quiet, devastating justice. Beside him, Smoky stood like a statue of black and tan granite, his aggressive yet loyal expression a final silent judgment on the man who tried to destroy them. The $5 cabin was gone, but the trap it had set was ironclad. The corporation hadn't just failed to take William's land. They had handed him the keys to their own destruction. With the corporation dismantled, a strange thing happened in the valley of Oakhaven. The people who had once whispered madman and eyesore began to gather at the edge of Williams' property. They didn't come with pitchforks or lawsuits. They came with hammers, lumber, and heavy machinery. Led by the local farmers whose water William had saved, a grassroots movement started. They realized that while they were building houses of cards, William Wynne was building a foundation for the future. William watched from the entrance of his remaining underground level as a convoy of civilian trucks pulled up. He reached for his belt, his military instincts on high alert, but Smoky's tail gave a single, slow wag. The dog knew the scent of friendship. The town's mayor, a woman who had once signed the eviction notice, stepped forward. She didn't offer a bribe. She offered an apology and a new deed, one that merged the surrounding worthless acres into a permanent wildlife and veteran sanctuary, with William Wynne as its lifetime guardian. They began to build, not a shack and not a luxury mansion, but a hybrid of William's tactical ingenuity and the community's warmth. As the new structure rose, a reinforced stone lodge with the Quonset's signature arch roof, William found himself doing something he hadn't done in decades. He worked alongside others. He taught the local men how to weld for strength, not just beauty. He showed the kids how Smoky could track a scent through a wideout. The $5 investment had grown into something money could never buy, a home that was finally, truly, part of community. Years have passed since the $5 cabin became the legend of the Wyoming Valley. The Smoky Sanctuary now stands as a beacon for veterans and a school for survival. But at its heart, it remains the private domain of a man and his dog. William Wynne is 50 now, the salt and pepper of his beard having turned almost entirely to silver, matching the streaks in his military buzz cut. His body carries the echoes of a dozen battles and the strain of building a mountain from a molehill. But his gaze has never been sharper. Every evening, as the shadows stretch long across the sagebrush, William and Smoky take their position on the high point, a reinforced observation deck that sits directly above the old underground command center. From here, they can see the entire valley. They see the lights of town where children sleep safely, and they see the vast, untamed wilderness that William has sworn to protect. The corporation is a ghost, the scandal a memory, but the lesson remains. Preparation is the highest form of love. As the first stars begin to pierce the violet Wyoming sky, William leans back, his hand resting on the broad, muscular shoulders of an aging but still fierce Smoky. They don't need the high-tech sensors or the steel plating to feel secure anymore. They have the respect of a valley and the peace of a mission fulfilled. The crazy veteran isn't a headline anymore. He's a ghost story for some, a hero for many, and a guardian for all. He bought a ruin for $5, but he built a legacy that is priceless. William closes his moss-green eyes for a moment, listening to the wind. It no longer sounds like a warning. It sounds like home. Just as the valley began to breathe again, a shadow from William's past emerged from the obsidian darkness of a Wyoming midnight. A black, unmarked helicopter, running without lights, ghosted over the North Ridge. William Wynne woke before the sound even reached the cabin. His soldier's instinct was a tripwire that never slept. It wasn't the corporation this time. It was the ghost, Colonel Silas Vance, William's former commanding officer from a redacted Black Ops unit in Kandahar. Vance hadn't come for land or water. He had come for the sovereign drive, a piece of encrypted military hardware William had supposedly destroyed 10 years ago to prevent it from falling into the wrong hands. Vance knew William's weaknesses, or so he thought. He knew about the $5 cabin and the underground fortress, but he didn't know about Smoky. As Vance's elite extraction team fast-roped onto the property, they encountered a perimeter that defied every tactical manual they owned. William didn't hide. He stepped onto the porch of the new stone lodge, his moss-green eyes as cold as the mountain runoff. He wore his old tactical vest, the salt and pepper streaks in his beard catching the moonlight like silver wire. "You're trespassing on civilian soil, Silas." William's voice was a low, dangerous rumble. From the shadows behind him, Smoky emerged, his 30-kilogram frame tense like a coiled spring. This wasn't a search and rescue dog anymore. This was a K-9 operative in combat mode. Vance's men leveled their suppressed rifles, but they hesitated. They saw the square jawline and the broad shoulders of the man who had trained half of them. The $5 cabin was no longer just a shelter. It was the site of a final reckoning between a man of honor and a ghost who traded in blood. Vance wanted to drive, but William had spent 10 years turning this acre into a labyrinth that no map could decipher. The drive is in the mountain. Silas, come and get it, William challenged, stepping back into the shadows of the lodge. As the elite team breached the entrance, they found themselves not in a house, but in a tactical kill box. The arched steel corridors of the Quonset Foundation were designed to funnel intruders into dead, ends where the laws of physics and geometry worked against them. Smoky was a ghost in the machine. He moved through the ventilation shafts and hidden floor panels with a speed that defied thermal. Tracking. He didn't attack to kill. He attacked to disorient. A bite to a boot, a shove in the dark, a phantom bark echoing from 3 directions at once. The elite soldiers, the best the government could buy, began to unravel. They were fighting a man who had nothing to lose and a dog who lived for his master's nod. Deep in the heart of Level 2, Vance finally cornered William. The room was lined with silver-tinted mirrors and high-frequency jammers. Vance leveled his sidearm at William's chest. "Give me the drive, Wynne, and I'll let the dog live." William let out a short, dry laugh that didn't reach his moss-green eyes. "You still don't get it, Silas. I didn't hide the drive in the bunker." Suddenly, the floor beneath Vance's feet tilted. Smoky had triggered a hydraulic release from a remote substation. The Sovereign drive wasn't a piece of hardware. It was the data William had already integrated into the valley's new infrastructure. The mountain itself was a drive, and Vance was currently trapped in its recycle bin. The sun began to bleed over the Wyoming peaks as the black helicopter was forced to land by local law enforcement and federal backup. Agent Graves had seen the unauthorized flight path and moved in. Vance's team was disarmed not by a firefight, but by the sheer tactical superiority of a man and his dog. As Vance was led away in zip ties, he looked back at William Wynne. "You can't keep it secret forever, Wynne. That data, it changes everything." William didn't blink. "It already did, Silas. It built a town. It saved a valley. It's not a secret anymore. It's a foundation." William stood on the scorched grass of his lawn, Smoky sitting panting but uninjured at his side. Agent Graves approached, looking at the stone lodge that had survived yet another siege. "Wynne, you realize this property is now technically a site of national interest?" Graves asked, half joking, half concerned. William looked at the ruins of the original Quonset hut entrance, then at the new, thriving community center. "It's just a $5 cabin, Graves. Or at least, that's what the tax records say." As the federal teams cleared out, William and Smoky took their usual spot on the ridge. The Sovereign drive data was now safely encrypted within the code of the valley's self-sustaining power and water grid, a gift from a veteran to a people who once doubted him. The ghosts were gone. The corporations were defeated. All that remained was the mountain, the man, and the dog. William reached down and scratched Smoky behind the ears. The dog leaned into his master's hand, a fierce protector finally at rest. The $5 investment had become a $50 million legacy of peace. Nature doesn't care about legal victories or corporate downfalls. Just as the valley began to treat William Wynne like a local legend, the ground itself decided to remind everyone who was truly in charge. It started with a low-frequency hum, a vibration that only Smoky felt at first. The 30-kilogram German shepherd stood up in the middle of the night, a low growl vibrating in his chest, his eyes fixed on the reinforced floorboards of the lodge. Then the world tore apart. A massive tectonic shift, triggered by the corporation's earlier illegal deep well fracking, sent a shock wave through the valley. In the lodge of Smoky, The crazy engineering saved lives again. While the fancy homes in Oakhaven saw their foundations snap like dry twigs, William's arched steel and stone sanctuary flexed with the earth. But William knew the real danger wasn't on the surface. The earthquake had breached the primary geothermal vent he used for power. If the pressure wasn't manually bled off, the entire ridge would become a localized volcano of steam and shattered rock. William grabbed his heavy-duty thermal suit, his moss-green eyes reflecting the red strobe of the emergency alarms. At 50, his body felt every year of his service, but his jaw remained a square-jawed wall of determination. "Smoky, we're going deep," he commanded. They didn't head for the exit. They headed for the deepest hatch in Level 3. The community he had just started to trust was now sitting on a ticking time bomb, and the only man who knew how to defuse it was a veteran they had once tried to evict for $5. The descent into Level 4 was like entering the throat of a dragon. The temperature was rising 10 degrees for every floor they dropped. Hot steam hissed from the fractured limestone, turning the air into a blinding white soup. William relied on Smoky's nose more than his own eyes. The dog could scent the difference between natural air and the sulfurous gas leaking from the breach. "Find the valve, Smoky. Find it." They were deep beneath the original $5 cabin site now, in a sector William had carved out for extreme emergencies. The pressure was so high that the steel walls were groaning, a sound like a dying beast. William's moss-green eyes were stinging, his breath coming in ragged gasps through his respirator. Suddenly, Smoky lunged forward, barking through the fog. He had found a primary release wheel, but it was blocked by a fallen slab of reinforced concrete. William threw his broad shoulders against the slab. His muscles screamed, the sun-kissed rugged skin of his arms slick with sweat and condensation. He was 50 years old, fighting the weight of the world, but he had a 30-kilogram K9 partner who wouldn't let him quit. Smoky dug his paws into the dirt, barking a rhythmic cadence that seemed to give William the extra strength he needed. With a roar of effort, the slab moved just enough. William reached for the wheel, the metal so hot it sizzled against his thermal gloves. The screech of the valve opening was the sweetest sound William had ever heard. A massive plume of excess steam was redirected to the external vent stacks, the very vents the neighbors once called the madman's chimneys. On the surface, the townspeople of Oakhaven watched in awe as 3 pillars of white vapor shot hundreds of feet into the night sky, bleeding off the pressure that would have leveled their homes. The tremors stopped. The mountain fell silent. When William and Smoky finally emerged from the hatch, they were unrecognizable, covered in soot, limestone dust, and grease. William collapsed onto the stone porch, his tall frame finally giving out. Smoky curled up next to him, his athletic body trembling with exhaustion, but his eyes never leaving the perimeter. They had saved the valley a third time, and this time, the crazy architecture of the Quonset cabin had been the only thing that held the earth together. As the sun rose, Agent Graves and the town's mayor arrived, seeing the steam still whistling softly from the vents. They didn't ask about permits or codes. They simply looked at the exhausted veteran and his dog. William Wynne looked at the spot where the original $5 shack had been, now a solid stone monument. He realized he didn't buy a piece of land back then. He bought a destiny. He reached out and touched Smoky's head. "We're done, buddy," he whispered. "The mountain is safe." The $5 investment had become the heartbeat of the valley. The earthquake hadn't just cracked the geothermal vents. It had peeled back the skin of history. Deep in the newly formed fissures beneath the Level 4 sector, William Wynne discovered something that wasn't in his blueprints. Behind a collapsed limestone wall lay a forgotten Cold War relay station, a ghost bunker from 1962 that had been erased from every official map. It was filled with vacuum tube tech, encrypted logbooks, and a crate of experimental prototypes that the modern military would kill to reacquire. But William wasn't the only one who noticed the anomalous readings during the quake. A group of scavengers, highly trained black market relic hunters, had been monitoring the seismic, data from a base in the nearby mountains. They saw the signature of the reinforced lead shielding being exposed. To them, William's $5 cabin wasn't just a nuisance or a sanctuary anymore. It was the X on a treasure map worth hundreds of millions. William stood in the dust-filled silence of the 1960s bunker, his tactical flashlight cutting through the gloom. He ran a hand over a rusted console, his moss-green eyes reflecting the dull glow of ancient dials. Smoky stood by the entrance, his fur bristling. The dog didn't care about history. He cared about the perimeter. A new scent was drifting down the ventilation shafts, a mix of high-octane fuel and professional-grade climbing chalk. The scavengers were already on the ridge. William Wynne tightened the laces on his boots, his square jaw set. The veteran had spent his life protecting the future. Now, he had to defend the secrets of the past. The scavengers didn't come with warrants or warnings. They came with flashbangs and silenced submachine guns. They breached the upper lodge through the skylights, thinking they could catch the old man in his sleep. But William Wynne was already 3 levels down, turning the very mountain into a gauntlet of shadows. He knew every inch of the Quonset's steel ribs and every secret passage he'd carved into the limestone. Split up. Find the vault, the scavenger leader barked into his comms. It was the last mistake he'd make. In the pitch-black corridors, Smoky was a ghost. The dog didn't need light to hunt. He used the acoustics of the arched ceilings to mask his movements, appearing behind the intruders like a nightmare made of fur and teeth. He disarmed the scout with a single, precise strike to the wrist, vanishing back into a hidden floor panel before the man could even scream. William moved with the lethal efficiency of a man who had cleared 1,000 rooms. He used the 1960s bunker's manual override to slam heavy blast doors, isolating the scavengers into small, manageable groups. He didn't want a bloodbath. He wanted information. He cornered the leader in the old relay room, his tall, muscular frame blocking the only exit. "You're a long way from home for a few crates of rusted tubes," William said, his moss-green eyes burning with a cold fire. The leader leveled his weapon, but Smoky was already perched on a generator behind him, ready to launch. The $5 cabin was no longer a home. It was an interrogation chamber. By dawn, the scavengers were zip-tied and lined up on the porch of the lodge, their high-tech gear piled in a heap like scrap metal. Agent Graves arrived in a helicopter, but this time, he didn't come to investigate William. He came to thank him. The ghost bunker contained data that proved a high-level security breach from decades ago, a leak that William had inadvertently plugged by simply being the man who bought the land for $5. You've got a habit of finding things the government wants to stay buried. When Graves said, looking at the aging veteran, William Wynne stood there, his rugged skin caked with the dust of 60 years of history, his salt and pepper hair messy from a fight. He looked at Smoky, who was calmly licking a small scrape on his paw. "I don't want the history, Graves. I just want the peace." William made a deal. The government could have the tech and the data, but the bunker would be sealed forever with a foot of reinforced concrete, and his acre would be declared a no-fly zone in perpetuity. The price of silence was steep, but for the first time, William felt the weight of his past finally lifting. He watched as the heavy trucks hauled away the crates of Cold War ghosts. He had defended his home against corporations, ghosts of his own unit, and now, the literal shadows of history. As the last truck left, William and Smoky walked to the edge of the ridge. The $5 cabin was gone, replaced by a sanctuary that was now the most secure spot in the state. William Wynne looked at his dog, a slight smile touching his lips. $5, Smoky, best money I ever spent. The silence that settled over the lodge of Smoky wasn't empty. It was full of history, battles won, and the deep, abiding quiet of a mission completed. Years had bled into the bedrock of the Wyoming ridge since the $5 cabin first became a line of defense against greed and the ghosts of the past. William Wynne was 50 now, his body a map of scars from Kandahar to Oak Haven, but his spirit was unyielding. The short box beard was a pure streak of silver, matching the military buzz cut. His moss-green eyes, once sharp enough to pierce a whiteout, now held a deep, reflective stillness. The crow's feet telling tales of loyalty and survival. He stood on the observation point, a structure of steel and native stone that sat precisely above the sealed entrance of the old Cold War bunker. He had kept his side of the deal. The tech was gone. The past was buried under a foot of reinforced concrete, and his acre was a legal fortress. The air was crisp, scented with sagebrush and the distant, clean promise of snow. He wasn't a madman to the town anymore, nor a threat to the state. He was simply Wynne, the guardian of the valley's heartbeat. Smoky was by his side, an aging but still powerful 30-kilogram German shepherd. The black and tan coat was dusted with silver around the muzzle, and his gait was slower. But the aggressive yet loyal expression had never faded. The dog sat on his haunches, his intense gaze mirroring his master's. They were two ancient sentinels, watching over a valley that finally understood their worth. William reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn object, a tarnished $5 gold piece, a relic from the same era as the bunker he'd sealed. He balanced it on his scarred thumb. $5, Smoky, William said, his voice a low, raspy rumble that carried the weight of the mountain. We bought a ruin, but we built a frontier. With a flick of his thumb, he sent the coin spinning into the deep, dark fissure that the earthquake had opened and he had never capped. It was his final offering to the mountain that had tested them and ultimately protected them. He didn't need the coin, and he didn't need the shack. The $5 investment hadn't been about the land. It had been about reclaiming his soul. He turned his back on the ridge, looking at the warm, inviting light of the lodge. He had spent his life fighting for a country that often forgot him, but he had built a home that would never forget his dog. William Wynne and Smoky walked toward the lodge, two legends forged in steel, stone, and an unbreakable bond. The frontier was closed. The war was over. Home was finally, truly found. The peace William had fought for was never meant to be static. In the winter of his 51st year, the sovereign drive data, now the backbone of Oak Haven's independent power grid, triggered a global anomaly. It wasn't a breach, but a signal. A silent, encrypted handshake from deep space satellites that had been dormant since the Cold War. The $5 cabin, or the fortress it had become, was inadvertently acting as the only ground station capable of receiving a message that would change the course of energy physics forever. But a signal of that magnitude is a beacon for sharks. Within 48 hours, High-altitude surveillance gliders from an unknown shadow syndicate began circling the ridge. They didn't want the land, the water, or the old tech. They wanted the frequency, the key to infinite, clean energy hidden in the code William had protected. William stood on the observation point, his moss-green eyes tracking the invisible lines in the sky. Smoky was at his side, his black and tan fur standing on end as the air grew thick with static. "They're coming for the light, Smoky," William whispered. He didn't call Agent Grave this time. He knew that some battles were too big for the law. He activated the Lodge's final defense layer, a massive electromagnetic dampening field hidden within the Quonset's arched steel ribs. The $5 investment was about to go dark, effectively vanishing from every satellite and radar on the planet. To save the signal, William Wynne had to turn his home into a black hole. The Shadow Syndicate didn't send soldiers. They sent infiltrators, autonomous, spider-like drones and cloaked mercenaries designed for zero-footprint extraction. They thought that because the Lodge had gone dark, the Master was blind. They were wrong. William Wynne had spent decades fighting in the dark. He didn't need radar. He had Smoky. The German shepherd's ears were more sensitive than any sensor, picking up the high-frequency whine of the cloaking devices. In the absolute silence of the electromagnetic void, the hunt began. William moved through the arched corridors like a predator in his own den. He used no modern tech, only the mechanical traps he'd built into the $5 foundation. A tripwire made of piano wire, a floor plate that dropped into a pit of sand, a pressurized steam jet triggered by a shadow. One by one, the invisible intruders were neutralized by a man who knew every creak of the floorboards. Smoky was the hammer. He didn't bark. He was a silent shadow that struck from the vents. He could sense the heat signatures of the cloaked suits. He lunged, his 30-kilogram weight enough to shatter the delicate optics of the infiltrator's gear. When William finally cornered the lead operative in the central vault, the man tried to activate a self-destruct sequence. William didn't shoot. He simply grabbed the man's wrist with a hand that had spent 50 years forging steel. "This house doesn't break," William said, his voice a low, terrifying rasp. "It only endures." The invasion failed, but the message was received. William knew he couldn't hold the frequency forever. It was too big for one man, even a man with a fortress. He made a decision that shocked the global intelligence community. He didn't hand the data to the U.S. government, and he didn't sell it to the highest bidder. He used the $5 cabin's original tax-delinquent status to create a sovereign digital trust. He broadcast the energy key to every university and nonprofit research center on Earth, but with a dead man switch tied to Oakhaven's water supply. If the valley was ever threatened, if the land was ever seized, the key would delete itself. He turned the $5 acre into the most valuable hostage in human history. The crazy veteran had outplayed the world's elite by using the simplest law of all, the law of the land. As the world began to adapt to the new era of clean energy, the Lodge of Smoky became a place of pilgrimage. But William didn't let them in. He stayed behind the reinforced gates, his broad shoulders and moss-green eyes a constant reminder that the secret was safe but guarded. He began to mentor a small group of hand-picked veterans, men and women who had lost everything like he had. He was no longer just a survivor. He was an architect of a new kind of peace. Smoky, now the patriarch of a new line of K-9 trainees, sat on the porch, watching the new recruits learn the art of the madman's defense. Time is the only enemy a soldier can't defeat. As William Wynne entered his late 50s, the toll of his life began to show. His moss-green eyes were still sharp, but the salt and pepper hair was now a dignified white. Smoky, too, was reaching the end of his watch. The legendary K9, who had pulled men from floods and fought off cloaked assassins, now spent more time in the sun on the porch than patrolling the vents. In a quiet ceremony at the edge of the ridge, William knelt before Smoky. His muscular, scarred hands trembled slightly as he unbuckled the heavy tactical collar Smoky had worn for a decade. He didn't replace it with a new one. Instead, he placed it on a memorial hook inside the lodge's Hall of Honor. At his side stood Shadow, Smoky's finest protege, a powerful, black and tan pup who carried the same aggressive yet loyal fire in his eyes. "Your watch is over, old friend," William whispered, his voice cracking for the first time in 30 parts. Smoky let out a soft, contented huff and rested his head on William's knee. The town of Oakhaven held a silent vigil that night. They didn't see a crazy veteran and a dog anymore. They saw a bond that had held their world together when it was falling apart. William Wynne looked at Shadow, then back at Smoky. The legacy of the $5 cabin wasn't the steel or the data. It was the spirit of the Guardian that would never truly die as long as there was someone to hold the line. The story of William Wynne and the $5 cabin ends where it began, on a dusty Wyoming ridge, under a sky so big it makes a man feel like a speck of dust. William is 60 now. He lives in a world he helped save, but he still lives by the code of the soldier. The Lodge of Smoky is no longer a secret. It is a landmark of human resilience. People from all over the world look toward the ridge and see the arched steel roof, a symbol of a man who took an insult and turned it into an icon. William stands on the balcony, his white-silver hair caught in the Wyoming wind. He looks down at the valley where children play in parks powered by the signal he protected. He looks at the new generation of veterans patrolling the perimeter, guided by the spirit he instilled. And he looks at the spot where Smoky is buried, under a simple stone marked only with the words, "The best $5 ever spent." He is no longer forced out. He is no longer alone. He bought a ruin for $5, but he built a kingdom of honor. As the sun sets on the final part of this journey, William Wynne takes a deep breath, his moss-green eyes clear and full of grace. He whistles once. Shadow, the new guardian, leaps to his side. The man and the dog stand as one, eternal sentinels against the coming night. The $5 cabin is a legend, but the veteran's heart is the true fortress. This was never a story about a house. It was a story about home.